Hi, Adam here with FCP Euro. Today we're going to be changing the rear trailing arm bushings on this 2015 Volvo V60. Now, the trailing arm bushings are going to be basically the same design for all P3 models. That includes the S80, the V70, the XC60, and so on. So while we do this, you will be able to apply this DIY to all of those. So right here we have a P3 trailing arm bushing, an OE version, and you can sort of see where the failure part might be. The trailing arm comes off of this bushing. This is what mounts it up to the chassis. So what you're going to have is a twisting motion. A lot of times with cars with higher miles or cars that are subjected to extreme temperatures, road salt, stuff like that, you're going to get a failure in these voids, and eventually this will break out and be able to move around much more freely. A lot of times that will manifest itself as a squeak as the rubber kind of twists around in there. You could also get a little bit of wandering in the rear end, and you will have trouble aligning your vehicle. For this DIY, I'm going to be removing the entire trailing arm from the car. It's not too difficult. It's just a couple control arms, large bolts. If you have an impact gun, it's not that big of a deal. You might find in your particular setup that you can actually do this job on the car, but generally you're going to want to take the entire arm off so you can have much better access to the bushing. If you're replacing this bushing, you basically have three options. The first is to take the entire trailing arm off of the car and replace it. That's going to be obviously more parts cost involved in that, but they are available from genuine Volvo, at least they are right now. The second would be to take the trailing arm off and press out the old bushing and press in a new one. Now it requires a special tool, or you can just kind of struggle with it, or you can drop it off at a local mechanic shop. All of those are going to be much more labor intensive, obviously, because this is a press-in metal race on here. The third option, which is what I'm going to be doing today, is install a PowerFlex bushing. So basically, PowerFlex has engineered the main failure point out by allowing this inside bushing to pivot. Obviously, all PowerFlex bushings come with a lifetime warranty, so longevity is a factor in their design. So here are some of the tools that I'm going to be using on this job. Using the method today, you'll need a Sawzall or any sort of small hacksaw would also work to get the bushing out of the bushing race. You also need something to clean up the inside of the trailing arm bushing race, basically, to make sure it's nice and smooth. So I used a green pad, like a Brillo pad, and some brake clean that worked pretty good. To bust the bushing out, you're going to need a hammer. Also, it helps to have a selection of torque wrenches. If you've got a Nevomat shock on the back, it'll have to go all the way up to 280 Newton meters. If not, around 200 Newton meter torque wrench would be fine for you. Large breaker bar. You're also going to need an assortment of extensions, a ratchet to take off the rear end link, 15 millimeter open-ended with a 5 millimeter hex. You also want something to hang up the rear caliper. Of course, for a job like this, a selection of sockets that go all the way up to 19 is going to be ideal for this job. Big flathead screwdriver you'll use, as you move through the job to undo different things. Highly recommend a 1/2 inch impact gun to take some of these big suspension bolts off. If not, you're going to need a huge breaker bar, and in some cases, using this much torque, you are at risk at snapping those bolts. So oil with penetrating oil and use an impact gun. That's basically my utmost recommendation for this. And finally, you're going to need a reliable spring compressor when you pull the rear spring out. So now that we've taken a look at the tools that you're going to need, let's get started. First step, obviously take the wheel off. These are going to be 19 millimeter lugs. All right, now you can see the trailing arm that we're going to be removing right here. It runs from the wheel hub, everything mounts to it. And it goes up to the front underneath this coverage I'll be taking off in a second. The first step I'm going to do before I take any of this stuff off is soak some of these bolts in penetrating oil to make it a little bit easier. Next up, I'm going to take this cover off. This basically keeps the road grime out of the bushing area. So it's going to be 5 18 millimeter, I wouldn't even call them nuts. They're kind of like clips, but they do thread onto studs. So I can call them a nut. Now we have access to the bushing. You can see on this side There are some things attached to it. We have a brake line here on this bracket, and a couple zip ties over here that are going to have to get cut when we take this arm down. And then you can see the two main big steel mounting bolts on either side of the bushing right here. Since we're removing all of these major connection points, that also includes a brake line, so we're just going to remove this caliper first and hang it out of the way. I can just remove this ABS sensor right here. And we're going to move up and disconnect this wiring and hydraulic lines from the trailing arm. Next step is going to be remove tension off of all of this rear suspension componentry. So that's going to be removing the spring. I have a compressor right here. Now I'm going to remove this top bolt. What this is going to do is remove the top control arm from the trailing arm, but it's also going to free up that bracket that's holding my caliper in place. So once this is out, I can move everything out of the way on top. Up next, we could take the rear sway bar end link off. The inside of this, if you have an OEM link on, is going to be a 5mm Allen and then a 15mm to loosen. Up next, we just disconnect the bottom bolt on the shock absorber so that way it can be free from the trailing arm. Up next is the tow arm right here. So right now I'm just going to put a support up underneath this thing as we continue to disconnect components. You can use a 2x4, any old thing, just to try to keep this from crashing down as we take the last couple of bolts out. So we're approaching the final steps. I'm going to take this lower link down, but for right now I'm just going to loosen this until it's hand tight. That way I can manipulate this arm while I remove the front. So as you can see, there's a bracket here that connects up to the bushing. The PowerFlex version has a bolt that will basically serve at the same purpose as that. You'll see that in a little bit later. Now with this free, move it out of the way, and we can take off the two main bushing bolts. Keep in mind that the arm will start to come down when you take the second one off. So make sure to keep an arm stabilizing the entire link. I'm going to leave this one in for now because this is going to take a breaker bar. My impact won't be able to do that with the size of the extension. And with the bushing removed, and you have control of it, you get a feel of the weight. You could just remove the last bit of that bottom bolt. Now with the arm off the car, we can move to the workbench to secure it in a vise and get started on removing the bushing using the Sawzall method. Doing it this way and installing a PowerFlex bushing removes the need for an application-specific special bushing tool. What I'm going to do is cut ever so slightly through this bearing race. What I'm going to try to do is not cut all the way through and weaken it, because there's a lot of bearing or bushing sticking out. So hopefully, if I put a couple good nicks in here, not going all the way through, I can then just use a hammer or a chisel and just pop the rest of it out. You don't want to go all the way. If you do go all the way and nick this, make sure to round out your little burr to avoid basically cutting the bushing that's going to be in here. So this requires finesse to be very careful. It's best to start where you can see it and get right up on it, so you can see how far through you're getting, and also so you can see how flat you are. And so you can see how thin that nick is right now. And on the other side, it didn't go all the way through, but it was weak enough that a little piece of it kind of moved up. So I'm just going to hit that with the hammer and just see what happens before starting another groove someplace else. Right, so it collapsed a little bit. Perfect. I'm going to put another groove on the bottom now and see if I can get it to really move around and basically massage it out of place. And to do that, I'm going to flip it over so that I can keep a better eye on it. So just enough to hold it in. If you have a big rubber bush or like a clamper on here, that really does help even out the force. Yep, and then just inspect where you did your cuts, make sure you didn't nick anything, and everything looks good here. I'll probably take a little bit of sandpaper and just smooth this out before the PowerFlex bushing goes in, just to make sure that's a nice smooth contact. So it's really nice because every PowerFlex bushing pack comes with a set of instructions. So you could look right in here and see the orientation. You can see the thick part of the outer bushing is going to face the inside of the car. So this is going to go in like that. So for the outer bushing, basically you're going to line this up with this notch, this welded tab on here. So this is going to fit like this. This is not, outer race is not going to get the grease. This is going to get some soapy water, some dish soap to help pop it on, but then it will, once it dries out in there, it'll stay in place and it'll stick. We're going to put a zip tie or two through one side now that it's kind of started. That will basically keep it from popping out, and that will hopefully give us free rein to continue pressing it through on the other side without the possibility of it backing out on this side. Just make sure that you tie it in, it's nice and lined up, which it is. So use the supplied grease. This is basically PowerFlex's proprietary grease. I don't know if it is any different than normal grease, but comes with it. They know what they're doing. So apply this to the bore of the bushing. Keep in mind not to use all of it because you're going to want to use half of it on the other side. Okay, so we're going to end up using, we have just a cheap Harbor Freight press here. If you're thrifty, you could also do this with a floor jack, just like maybe up against the bottom of a car or a heavy table. Depends on how much this force takes. So basically, make sure that this bracket is facing on the inside of the car, basically away from, or on the other side of a brake. Use some pieces of old wood you got around. So now that we have the bushing pressed in, I could talk a little bit about the different setups. Some cars you'll notice when you pull the bushing off that it looks a little bit different than this. It might have a larger bracket on it. PowerFlex includes the adapter bracket in case you have the equipment that warrants it. And you would just basically bolt it on like so. On this vehicle, there's a bracket, actually on all vehicles, there's a bracket where the brake line and some wiring connects up to the bottom of the bushing. That's what this bolt is for. So the bolt is going to go into the front of it. Doesn't usually thread in, it should just be a hole, but there's like a little burr in there. So this is going to thread in. And then that basically does the same thing as that stud. The only problem is that this has to be connected up and tightened down while the bushing is off of the car. So just keep that in mind and you'll see it when we put it up there. So let's go over to the car and demonstrate it in situ. I'm just going to thread this in a little bit for now just to hold it into place. This isn't the final because I am going to be continuing to bolt this stuff on. Now that it's up there and in place, now I can start moving the stuff around, get it situated, and start the final reassembly. This bracket is going to be positioned onto this. So move that down. And you can see how that slots up into there. This is a 13mm lock nut. Kind of working by sense of feel up here. All right, got it. So using a little bit of Loctite on these steel bolts. Lower medium strength will work good. I'm going to basically hand thread these in for now before I go ahead and tighten everything else back down. Up next, I'm going to do this top bolt, which is actually going to hold onto this bracket, which also holds onto some of the brake wiring, the ABS sensor, and the line. So I'm going to free up the caliper to let it move a little bit more free. Since I'm no longer disconnecting everything, I'm putting it back together. This can Now move up. And this is not the correct hole. As you can see in the bracket, there is a hole for this to line up into, so don't just go and tighten it down right away. We're gonna leave every connection loose until the final torque, because this needs to be loaded when you start tightening it down. Okay, up next we can do this bottom link right here. Just make sure to give them a good wiggle. Some of this will be under a little bit of tension because these are all obviously rubber components. Just want to be very careful not to cross thread any of these in. So that feels positive, that's threaded in. And we can install the lower shock. This is an 18 millimeter, I'm going to snug it up. It's 150 Newton meters once it lands. Up next we can attach the sway bar end link back to the knuckle here. It'll just rotate around a little bit in the bushing at the top. The end link takes a 15 millimeter nut and a 5 millimeter Allen if you're going with the OEM. So the torque on this is 55 Newton meters if you have a torque wrench that's able to pull that off. So now that we have all of the bolts for the control arms and trailing arms in, but not tightened, we're going to raise up the suspension until the center of the hub is 381 millimeters to the top of the fender well. That way, that's kind of what Volvo assumes this to be like in the resting position, and that's what you should do whenever you tighten any rear component on one of these cars, and that keeps the bushing from tearing over time because it's always under load. It basically keeps the load off of the bushing when it's sitting at its usual ride height. And while you're going up, just make sure you're not pinching anything. Everything here looks nice and clear. First one is going to be the rear lower link. This is going to be 110 Newton meters. Next up we have the tow arm. That's 130 Newton meters. Now we can do the top link. It's 130 Newton meters as well. The front bushing bolts are 180 Newton meters. Pretty tight. Okay, now we can put the caliper back on, get that out of the way, and hook up all of the different lines and stuff to almost wrap it up. Caliper bolts are 110 Newton meters. At this point, I can lower the suspension down again because we're gonna have to put the spring in. So at this point, you can go ahead and start re-clipping in the brake lines and the wiring down here. Just a matter of sort of lining them up and snapping them in. It's a little tight up against the bushing on this side because of the added size of the PowerFlex one. So I might add a zip tie up here too. Not super tight, but also loose enough so that, or tight enough that it doesn't move around a lot, but also loose enough that you're not going to accidentally crimp this over time or it wears into the wiring. Don't forget to put that brake line into the bracket on the front of the arm. There we go. Locate your ABS sensor wire. If you have an all-wheel drive car, obviously it's going to be a little bit different, but still every wheel will have one, and you can go ahead and connect that right now. Now we can put the suspension spring back in. Just be careful, obviously. It's under a lot of tension. And just go ahead and make sure that the spring seat looks about right. In this case, it does. This job was done on a front-wheel drive car that does not have Nevo Mat suspension. If you do have a Nevo Mat shock back here, which is going to be a large shock absorber with kind of like a boot on it, that's going to be 280 Newton meters to fasten that one up. That's an M16 bolt. And then if you have all-wheel drive, you're going to be also putting an axle through here and tightening it down. That's going to be 35 Newton meters and 90 degrees on that. And that 90 degrees obviously means that that's a one-time use only bolt. So if you're doing this job on an all-wheel drive car, don't forget to get axle bolts as well. Don't forget to cover up all your good work with this plastic cover that we took off at the very beginning. And these little nut clip things are 18 millimeters. And finally, we're going to put the wheel on. If during the adventure off of the car you got grease or anything on the rotor, now's a good time to just spin it around, clean it off before putting it up. You don't want grease or dirt on your rotor surface. And the final torque on the wheels is 140 Newton meters, and always tighten in a star pattern. So I hope that gives you a good idea on what you'll be up against if you're changing the trailing arm bushings on any P3 chassis Volvo like this V60. As you can see, having an impact gun really helps, especially when taking off those really large lower control arm bolts and some of the other suspension bolts back there. You're going to find a couple of differences depending on if you have all-wheel drive or front-wheel drive, or even some of the equipment options are going to have slightly different bushings, but those are all laid out in our application guide, so be sure to check that out if you are shopping for bushings, or just get the PowerFlex one. PowerFlex one covers all of them. Like I said, it has that cool adapter. So if you like this video, leave a like below. If you have any questions or comments, hit the comment section and subscribe for more Volvo content.